Hi everyone, welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and today we're going to talk about Kodshim Kalim versus Kodshei Kodashim. Kodshim Kalim, as the name implies, means lesser sanctity korbanot, and Kodshei Kodashim, as the name implies, means greater sanctity korbanot. It turns out that korbanot, as a category, are split in two. In the Gemara in Zevachim on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph 37a, there's a discussion of three exemplars of Kodshim Kalim, namely the Korban Pesach, the Bechor Behema Tahora, firstborn kosher animal, and Maaser Behema, the tithing of animals. All three of those are grouped together in the Gemara in Zevachim. I don't think they're grouped together because you can find some deeper connection. Yes, it's true. You can connect Bechor Behema Tahora to Korban Pesach because both of them have to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim. Yes, you can connect Maaser Behema to Bechor Behema Tahora because they're both about ownership of animals. But I don't know that the category that is underlying these three is really such a distinctive category. Rather, I think that they belong to the general category of Kodshim Kalim, which includes generally korbanot shlamim. Korbanot shlamim being korbanot that are partially eaten by the Mizbeach and partially eaten by regular people, in addition to giving certain portions to the Kohanim. Those are Kodshim Kalim in general. So I want to talk about that category. So let's take a look at just um, the impetus to look at that category, which is our Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach, because the truth is they are grouped together, not only in the Gemara and Zevachim on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, where there's a discussion of what does their matan damim look like, what does the placement of their blood on the altar look like, because that's less explicit. At least in the case of Maser Behema and Pesach, than other korbanot. But the Mishnah in Zevachim, already the Mishnah, right? Mishnah being earlier than Gemara, the Mishnah already discusses Bechor, Maser, and Pesach together and discusses them as typical Kodshim Kalim. Mishnah in Zevachim, Perek Hey, Mishnah Chet, that some people say every morning in their recitation of korbanot, HaBechor, VaMaser, VaPesach, Kodshim Kalim. Shchitatan b'chol makom ba'azara. A typical characteristic of Kodshim Kalim is that they do not, unlike Kodshei Kodashim, they do not have to be slaughtered at the northern side of the Mizbeach, but they can be slaughtered anywhere in that Azara. Vidaman ta'un matanachat. When it comes to the Bechor, Maaser, and the Pesach, they need one placement of blood, uvavad she'itain keneged esod, so long as the blood goes to the base of the altar. Now, even among Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach, there are differences. Shina b'achilatan, there are differences. HaBechor ne'echal kohanim. The Bechor is kind of a standout because it's eaten only by kohanim and their families. Whereas, v'hamaaser l'chol adam. The tithed animal is eaten by any person, right? Now, v'ne'echalin b'chol ha'ir, both of them can be eaten throughout Jerusalem, which is another characteristic of Kodshim Kalim. They don't have to be eaten in the Beit HaMikdash. They can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem. L'chol adam, again repeating any person. B'chol ma'achal, they can be eaten any way. They can be cooked in any way. L'shnei yamim v'layla echad. Shnei yamim v'layla echad, 2 days and one night. That is a typical time frame for the eating of Kodshim Kalim in general. Applies to korbanot shlamim in general. Pesach is a little bit of an outlier because a Pesach einu nechal ela balayla ve'einu nechal ela ad chatzot. Korban Pesach can only be eaten at night, and not only can it only be eaten at night, meaning you don't have 2 days and a night to eat it, it can only be eaten until mid-halachic night, until chatzot. Ve'einu nechal ela ad chatzot ve'einu nechal ela limnuyav. It also, even though obviously it can be eaten by non-kohanim, it has to be eaten by those who are registered for it. Ve'einu nechal ela tzali. It also can't be prepared any old way. It has to be roasted. But suffice it to say, the Bechor, the Maaser, and the Pesach are examples of Kodshim Kalim. Now, when you look at the bigger category of Kodshim Kalim and distinguish it from the category of Kodshei Kodashim, as Kahati does, Pinchas Kahati does, at the beginning of Masechet Zevachim, or at the intro to Masechet Zevachim, you start to see why these three are grouped together. So let's take a look. He says, Shiv'a minei Zevachim him. There are three types of korbanot. First, you have the ola, the fully burnt offering, which is considered Kodesh Kodashim. Hachatat, you have the sin offering, which you give if you've done a sin that if you did it on purpose, you would get karet, excision. Also, Kodesh Kodashim. You have the asham, a guilt offering, which you give for a number of different kinds of things. But a good example would be if you misused kachim, if you misused consecrated objects, because we're going to talk about that later, known as me'ilah, you would have to give an asham. You'd have to give that korban. It's also considered kodesh kodashim. Those first three, I'm already telling you, are Kodshei Kodashim. And then we have fourth category, shlamim. Shlamim is an offering that is eaten partially by the mizbeach, partially you give parts of it to the Kohen, who eats it with his family, and part of it is eaten by the Baalim, the people who brought the korban in the first place, right? So a korban shlamim is much more of your family meal. That is, from then on, that is Kodashim Kalim. And then we have the Bechor, firstborn animal, which the Kohen eats with his family, Maser Behema, the tithed animal, which any person, probably the owner of the animal, is going to eat, and the Korban Pesach, which of course is eaten by non-Kohanim also. So what you have already is you see Ola, Chatat, Asham, Shlamim. Those are big categories of korbanot. The kind of things that are left are Bechor, Maser Behema, and Korban Pesach. They're the outliers, so they get grouped together. But nonetheless, among these seven, you have Shloshet HaRishonim, the first three, the Ola, the Chatat, the Asham, Heim Kodshei Kodashim. Those are Holy of Holies. Okay, and we'll see what does that mean that it's Holy of Holies, it's a higher sanctity. Hashar, the rest of this list, Dahainu Shlamim, including Shlamim, except, there's an exception, there's a Shlamim that you give on Shavuot, which because of a limud in a pasuk, we actually don't consider it to be Kodashim Kalim, but otherwise, Shlamim in general. HaBechor, the eldest animal, Maser Behema, the tithed animal, Korban Pesach, Paschal Lamb, Kodashim Kalim. Those are all Kodashim Kalim. Now, if you want to see the language, how do we figure out that we know that a Chatat and an Asham and an Ola are all Kodshei Kodashim and the other ones are Kodashim Kalim? First of all, look at the first prakim of Vayikra, but also in Vayikra Yudalid, where we're talking about the Asham Mitzorah, we say, B'shachat et hakeves b'makom asher yishchat et hachatat ve'et ha'ola b'makom hakodesh. You have to shecht, you have to slaughter the lamb in the same place that you slaughter usually a chatat or an ola. Ki kachatat ha'asham hu lakohen kodesh kodashim hu. Because this asham, or asham in general, is like a chatat, it is holy of holies, right? So those three, chatat, ola, asham, kodshei kodashim. Now I have a nice little chart for you here to understand some of the technical differences between Kodshei Kodashim and Kodashim Kalim. But I want to get ultimately to what are some of the essential differences. So if we look here, we have a nice chart, Kodshei Kodashim, Makom HaShrita, where do they have to be slaughtered? B'tzfon HaMizbech, on the north side of the altar. You go down and look at Kodashim Kalim. What about the lesser sanctity? B'chol Hazarah. It can be anywhere in that courtyard. What about Zman Ha'achila? What about how long you have to eat the korban? Kodshei Kodashim, you have Yom V'Laila, a day and the night. That's it. Whereas for Kodashim Kalim, you have 2 days and a night. Now, it is true that there are some outliers. For example, the Nazir's korban can only be for a day and a night. Korban Pesach can only be at Chatzot. But in general, you have more than a day and a night. So far what we're seeing is Kodshei Kodashim, more restrictive, where you can slaughter them, how long you have to eat them. Kodashim Kalim, more expansive, where you can slaughter them, how long you have to eat them. What about Lamina Echal, who eats them? Kodshei Kodashim, Lezichrei Kahuna. Only the male Kohanim eat those, right? Chatat, Asham, only male Kohanim eat those. And where? Bazarat, they have to eat in the temple courtyard. Okay? And even, by the way, the Or HaBehema, even the skin of the animal goes to the Kohanim. very restrictive. Whereas when you look at Kodshim Kalim, well, when you're talking about a korban shlamim, and we include in that the Thanksgiving offering, the korban todah, what you give is you give a part, the chazeh and the shok. You give a part of the breast of the animal and the thigh of the animal to the Kohanim. But the basar, the rest of the meat, l'chol adam, anybody can eat it, right? Now, of course, the bechor is the outlier because the Kohanim can eat it, but it's not just the male Kohanim, it's their families too, right? Maser behema, anybody can eat. Pesach, only the people who registered. But the point is, the list of people who eat these things is more expansive than just male Kohanim. And where can it be eaten? Anywhere in Yerushalayim, right? And by the way, the skin of the animal goes to the owner of the animal, not to the Kohanim. So you get this sense that Kodshei Kodashim remain completely in the Mikdash, right? Completely in the Mikdash. They have to be eaten by male Kohanim in the Mikdash. Whereas Kodashim Kalim are a family meal. It might be for the family of the Kohen. It might be for any non-Kohen's family. So that already starts to give us a hint as to what is the difference between Kodshei Kodashim and Kodashim Kalim. So just a little bit more, something that's not mentioned on this chart in terms of the differences between them, is also there's a difference between them when it comes to Me'ila. I mentioned we'd get back to Me'ila. Me'ila being misuse of consecrated items for your own use. So the way that the Rambam discusses the difference between Me'ila when it comes to Kodshim Kalim and Me'ila, or I should say the Isser of Me'ila, the prohibition of Me'ila when it comes to Kodshei Kodashim is, you guessed it, the Isser of Me'ila when it comes to Kodshei Kodashim is much more restrictive. So we have here in the Rama Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Me'ila, Perek Bet, Kodshim Kalim, Ein Mo'alin Behen Ad Sheyizarei Kadam. When it comes to Kodshim Kalim, there is no problem of Me'ila until blood has been placed on the altar. Meaning, I want you to imagine what that means. What that means is the animal has already been consecrated. The animal may even have already been slaughtered. If you misuse the materials from that animal for your own private use, that is not considered me'ila until the blood has been put on the altar. And then he says, Nizrak Hadam, once the blood has been put on the altar, then Moalin be'emrehen ad she'yitzu lebeit hadeshen, then there is a prohibition of committing me'ila, of misusing, misappropriating for your own use, specifically when it comes to the organs of the animal, right? Because that's the only part that's going to go on the mizbeach. Ve'ein mo'alin be'devar ne'achal kemo shebe'arnu. But the rest of it, there is no me'ila on the rest of it, because once people can eat it, there's no isser me'ila anymore, right? So the idea of me'ila, applying the isser of me'ila, of misusing Kodshim Kalim, it's very minimal, right? It's very minimal. You could have an animal that's already consecrated and you misuse it, but because it was supposed to be for Kodshim Kalim, if the blood hasn't been sprinkled on the Mizbeach yet, we don't consider it Me'ila. And then even once the blood has been sprinkled on the Mizbeach, it's only for a very small portion of the animal itself. On the other hand, when you look in the following Halakha about Kodshei Kodashim, Kol Kodshei Kodashim Mo'alin Bahen Mi Shehukdeshu Ad Sheyisarei Kadam. Right? When it comes to Kodshei Kodashim, Korban Chatat, Korban Asham, Korban Ola, Me'ila, the Isser of Me'ila, the prohibition to use it appropriated for your own use, applies from the minute that animal was consecrated until the blood has been spilled on the Mizbeach. It applies to the whole animal. And then, once the blood has been spilled on the Mizbeach, Nizrak Hadam, if it has been spilled on the Mizbeach already, Mo'alin Bahen Bedavar Shekulo La'ishim, Me'ila does apply to any part of that animal that's going to be going completely on the altar, Achi Saref Yatzei Lebet Hadeshen, until it's burnt, Ve'ein Mo'alin Bedavar Ne'achal, and any part of it that gets eaten by the Kohanim, there is no Me'ila on that. But notice the idea that Me'ila is a problem from the moment something that's supposed to be Kodshei Kodashim is sanctified, whereas Me'ilah is not a problem for something that's Kodshim Kalim until the blood has already been put on the Mizbech. It already, again, tells you something about the way we are thinking about Kodshim Kalim. It's almost like we are thinking about Kodshim Kalim as it's yours. It belongs to you, right? And who's the you? The you is not the Kohanim, right? And in fact, when you look in Bamidbar Parak Yud Chet, there is a distinction made very clearly between who gets to eat Kodshim Kalim and who gets to eat Kodshei Kodashim. So we have, for example, not for example, the pasuk says, "Zeh yeh lecha mikodashei kodashim min ha'esh." This is going to be for you from among the holiest. Kol korbanam, lechol minchatam, lechol chatotam, lechol ashamam, asher yashivuli, kodesh kodashim lecha hu ulivanecha. All of this stuff, right? The chatat, the asham, the mincha also. Why isn't Ola mentioned? Because you don't eat it. It's totally burnt on the mizbech, right? It's all going to be for you and your sons. I'm going to be very gendered here, for your sons. B'kodesh HaKodashim tochlenu, you got to eat them as kodesh kodashim. Kol zachar yochalato kodesh yelach. Only the men are going to eat it. Why? Because they're going to eat it in the mikdash as kohanim. And then the next pasuk says, "V'zeh lecha trumat matanam." This will also be for you the gift offerings, the contributions from the Jewish people. Tatim, I give it to you. Levanecha v'livnotecha itcha lechok olam. I give it to your daughter, your sons, and your daughters. Meaning, it's for your whole family to eat. Kol tahor b'veitcha yochaloto. As long as somebody is ritually impure or makes themselves ritually impure, they can eat it. Meaning, and that is the realm of Kodshim Kalim. So you start to think to yourself, oh, wow, is it possible that actually, in some ways, Kodshei Kodashim, even the eating of the Kodshei Kodashim, that is only for male Kohanim, only in the Mikdash, that even that is kind of a part of the korban, as opposed to Kodshim Kalim, which seems like actually what's happening here is it is your family meal, and part of it has to be given on the Mizbeach. But it is more essentially your family meal. And interestingly enough, there is a perspective in Bava Kama Yud Bet Amud Bet that I don't think we hold Halakha, but it is an interesting perspective nonetheless, where Rabbi Yossi Aglili suggests that Kodshim Kalim is what we would call Mamon Baalim. It's owned, rather than thinking about it as Mamon Gavoha, rather than thinking about it as that which belongs to God, it's Mamon Baalim. It's that which belongs to human beings. Because after all, what are we talking about here? A korban Pesach that I'm going to eat? It's my family meal for that night. Yes, I give some of it onto the Mizbech, but it's my family meal for that night. Now, Halakha, we don't end up posing that way. And by the way, the ramifications would be like if somebody tried to use a korban shlomim to effectuate kiddushin. Would that work or would that not work, right? The ramifications would be if somebody stole, your shlomim from you and then lied about it, would they have to give the special asham and pay extra if they lied about stealing that? Right? If they lied under oath, right? That's what the Gemara there is talking about. But suffice to say, they're trying to figure out, korban shlamim and generally the kachim kalim, do they belong more to the realm of the mundane, even as you give part of it as a korban? And I think one of the things that is very convincing is that the Rambam, only when it comes to Kodshei Kodashim, the Rambam says it's a mitzvah to eat them, right? It says the Rambam in Maaseh HaKorbanot, Achilat hachatat v'ha'asham mitzvah aseh. For the Kohanim to eat the chatat and the asham is a positive commandment. He does not say, now, of course, you eating the korban Pesach, maybe we'd have to check exactly what he says, but he does not say there is a positive commandment to eat the korban shlamim, right? Doesn't say that. Shneimar, he says, v'achlotam asher kupar b'hem. You got to eat them. That which atonement, through which atonement is made, right? HaKohanim ochlim uvalim mitkaprim. The Kohanim eat them, and through that, right? It's almost like the Kohanim eating the korban is part of the kapara process, is part of the atonement process for the individual who brought that korban. right? V'hu adin l'shara kodshim she'ochlin otan hakohanim she'achilatan mitzvah. And that applies to other sacrifices that are eaten by priests. They're eating them are a mitzvah. Now, what does he mean by other sacrifices that are eaten by priests? Does he want to include Kodshei Kodashim, Kodashim Kalim, or is he also including a mincha? Like, right? So very interesting. How is the eating considered for these things? So what I would say is, when we look at our category of Pesach, Bechor, and Maser, instead of trying to figure out what do those three have in common with each other, it behooves us to think about what larger category within korbanot those are a part of. And the larger category that they are a part of are Kodashim Kalim. And in general, when we ask ourselves, Kodshei Kodashim, restrictive, Kodashim Kalim, less restrictive, why is that the case? It does seem to be that between the explanations of who gets to eat them, where they get to be eaten, how long they get to be eaten for, whether Me'ila applies to them or not. In all of those, the implication seems to be that when you think about the Chatat, the Asham, and the Olah, they are Mikdash animals. They belong to the Mikdash. The Kohanim eating some of them in the Mikdash is part of that belonging to the Mikdash. It's not part of the Avodah itself, but it's maybe part of the Kapara process. Whereas Kodashim Kalim, even though, of course, they're brought as korbanot to the Mikdash, but Kodashim Kalim, it seems like actually that's more the meal of the family. It could be the meal of a non-Kohen family. It could be the meal of a Kohen's family because Kodashim Kalim are what they get to partake in. And some of it has to be given to the Mikdash, right? The trajectory is different. Does it start in the Mikdash or does it start in the home, as it were? So they're going different directions. So that I think already starts to make something clear. But I don't want to leave you with just Kodshei Kodashim versus Kodashim Kalim, because there are other ways to divide up korbanot as well. So I want to just share with you the way that the Rambam divides up korbanot, because he is famous for his categorization schemes, which are incredibly helpful and incredibly organized. And I want to expand beyond the Kodshei Kodashim, Kodashim Kalim distinction and think about the different categories of korbanot. More granular is too strong a word, but with more diversity than that. So the Rambam, in his introduction, in his Perush HaMishnayot to Seder Kachim, he says that there are four overarching types of korbanot. And I want to look at these four overarching types. Hamin Harishon, the first overarching type, V'hu Korban Tzibor, collective sacrifices. Meaning, Hena korbanot shemakrivin b'chol yom, think about the korban tamid, korbanot that are given every day, meaning korban tamid, v'chol Shabbat, v'chol Rosh Chodesh, u'v'chagim, alehem ein lohosif, u'mehen ein ligrao l'dorei dorim. We're talking about the korbanot that are collective korbanot that are given on particular days of the week, of the month, of the year. That's the first category. Those are collective korbanot. V'hamin hasheni. What about the second type of korbanot? Hu korban yachid. That is the sacrifice not of the collective, the sacrifice of the individual. And then he says, nechalak lahei chalakim. That type is divided into 5 subcategories. Hachelek ha'echad, one of those subcategories, is sheyeh yachid chayav korban al ma'aseh she'asa al dibur shediber. That a person has to give a korban as an individual over something they did or something they said. Hachelek habet, second subcategory within individual korbanot. שיתחייב קורבן על עניין מן העניינים שיש בו בגופו. A person has to give a korban, an individual, because of something that is happening to their body. For example, someone has a child, the korban of the yoledet. Third, Halakha gimel, third subcategory within individual korbanot. שיתחייב בזה על שום עניין מהעניינים שיהיה בנכסיו. That you have to give a korban that is related to something that's happening to your stuff, to your possessions. And our Bechor and our Maser are the perfect example, right? The Maser Behema and the Bechor Behema Tehura. V'achelek hadalid, the fourth subcategory of individual korbanot, sheyitchayev bazeh b'higiyah zman yadua. An individual has to give an individual korban when a certain time on the calendar rolls around. For example, when you go on Aliyah L'Regel, you go on pilgrimage to Yerushalayim, you're supposed to bring at some point over that holiday an olat re'iyah, right? A burnt offering of seeing, right? Being seen by God and the pilgrimage, and shalmei simcha, korban shlamim, that are supposed to bring simcha to the holiday, joy to the holiday. The fifth subcategory of individual korbanot, a person who obligates themselves by volunteering to give a korban. But suffice it to say, right now what we have is the Rambam has given us two types of korbanot: the korban tzibur, collective korbanot, and the korban yachid, individual korbanot. His last two categories are where things seem to be a little more confusing. His third category is korban tzibur, a collective offering that's given on behalf of the community, but it is domeh korban yachid. It is similar to an individual offering. In what way? We'll see in a minute. And the fourth category, you guessed it, is a korban yachid, an individual's offering that is similar to a korban tzibur, a collective offering. And here, what we have to note is, generally speaking, the major difference between a korban tzibur, a collective offering, and a korban yachid, an individual offering, is that a korban tzibur, a collective offering, can override Shabbat, and it can override ritual impurity, whereas an individual offering cannot. So the examples that he gives for a korban tzibur, a collective offering, that's similar to an individual offering because it doesn't override Shabbat and it doesn't override ritual impurity, is para elem davar, when Beit Din makes a mistake and teaches wrong and everybody follows them, and there has to be a korban that is given as a kapara, as an atonement for this. That is, of course, a collective korban, but it is not something that can be dochesh Shabbat or Tumah. It's not something that can override Shabbos or ritual impurity. And for his fourth type of korban, where you have an individual's korban that is similar to a tzibur's korban because it can override Shabbat and Tumah, guess what his prime example is? Korban Pesach, right? We're not talking about where you yourself are tameh. We're talking about if the Kohen's tameh. If we're talking about if most of the tzibur is tameh, it can override it. So that's another way of breaking down korbanot, is not to think about them just as Kodshim Kalim, Kodshei Kodashim, but to think about them as korbanot tzibur and korbanot yachid. And even within that, to think about them as korbanot tzibur that do override Shabbos and Tumah, and korbanot tzibur that don't. Korbanot yachid that don't override Shabbos and Tumah, and korbanot yachid that do. So I hope that makes a little bit of seder, a little bit of organization out of what can otherwise feel like a kind of network and world of korbanot that it's hard to categorize in our minds. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.